for re-export out, right? Not for China's domestic market. And then if you think about exporting, we're getting back to this global value chain idea. And on the one hand, firms that specialize in exports actually don't need as many salesmen or customer support because they're just sending goods out. They don't deal with the final demand side. And so from that standpoint, they don't interact with local customers, so they may be able to be more routine focused and less abstract. They're, as I said here, they may be part of the global value chains where they're specializing in the relative routine tasks of the global value chain. And that wasn't discussed so much earlier about which parts of the global value chain are more abstract and which are more routine. Okay, so now at the same time, if I ask most people before kind of presenting these theoretical ideas, do you think FDI firms are more abstract or more routine, and export firms? Most people would think, oh, well, FDI firms and export firms are going to be better firms, right? Higher productivity, higher quality goods. All of those things actually would suggest that they would be more abstract intensive and less routine intensive. So these are not obvious predictions at all, and in some sense are ceteris paribus, right? Controlling for those other factors. Okay, and then of course, most of the technology predictions, it really depends on what kind of labor and tasks the technology is substituting for, but this has been described earlier. Most of the time we think of capital as being complementary to abstract or high-skilled jobs and not so much routine jobs. But let me go quickly and present some results. So our survey, again, was in Guangdong. We started in 2015, did 573 firms, 4,800 workers, and in 2016 we added a second province. Hubei province is Guangdong is the factory of China. It's the biggest manufacturing province on the coast near Hong Kong. Hubei is the biggest manufacturing province in central China. And we surveyed over 1,000 firms and over 9,000 workers in 2016. And so just some summary statistics, 32% FDI firms, which the way we sampled means that about 32% of workers in these two provinces are working in FDI firms. Export share of sales is about 26%, and then about 10% are state enterprises, and the average size of the firms is about 900 workers. So the measurement we did in the worker surveys of this CEASE project was taken from the Handel-O'Toole measures. They had done what was called the Princeton Data Improvement Initiative Survey and did a survey of workers in the United States. And there's a Journal of Labor Economics article which kind of presents some of the results of the analysis of that data. It's not a long form, so it's actually shorter than STEP and much shorter than ONET in terms of the number of questions. So to measure abstract, it's these 4 questions. And the answers are coded with 4 to 6 response categories. And then for routine, again, it's these 4 questions. And manual, as in the analysis of PIAC STEP, is just 1 question about whether they use physical tasks in their work. Okay. So one thing we do to try to calculate more accurately the tasks that are being completed within a specific firm is to use very detailed data we collected on the education and occupation composition of each firm and the whole worker survey data to estimate the task content of all of the work being done in the firm. What do I mean? What we do is we take all of the occupations and then, so we have 8 main occupation categories, which I'll show you in a minute. And then within within each occupation categories, we have 3 education categories, middle and below, high school, and then college and above. So we have 18 cells, and for each of those cells for the whole data set, we just look what is the mean kind of task demand for each of the types of tasks for that cell. And then in the firm questionnaire from our survey, we ask the firm what percentage of your people are in the different occupations, what percentage of your people are in the different education groups. And then from those data, we can just use the overall shares of these cells to kind of impute what we think the average task demand is. So we just use these mean task measures for each cell, multiplied by the percentage of workers in each firm that are in that cell, and we construct a firm task measure. Okay. All right, so, okay, so you can see here, these are just a few descriptive statistics, and then I will show you the final results. So this is just showing that there's really a specialization in terms of education between, so these are the 6 occupations that we divide all of the workers into, and managers, office workers, technicians, salesmen are, I think you describe them as relatively skilled job, where over 60% are actually college and above. And then the production workers and other workers are really low education jobs, so 73% of production workers don't even have a high school degree, they're middle and below. And other workers also, 60% are middle and below. So roughly you can divide the first 4 categories as skilled workers, highly educated workers, and the last 2 as less skilled. You can also look at the average task content by education group and by occupation group. And again, you see that there's this strong relationship between, not surprisingly, education and whether you're doing abstract versus routine tasks, as well as occupations. So the managers have the highest abstract score and have the lowest routine score. And then the production workers, the opposite, they're all negative, and these are all normed to 0 means in the whole sample. So production workers and others are less abstract intensive and more routine intensive. Okay. And finally, if you just look at the globalization indicators here, so here I've just described the firms that are FDI firms compared to the ones that are not, exporting firms and the non-exporting firms. So these are just crosstabs, really, of the percentage of people in the skilled occupations versus the unskilled occupations. And you can see that in the FDI firms, the share of workers who are unskilled is actually higher than in the non-FDI firms, and similarly for the exporting firms compared to the non-exporting firms. So that's consistent even at first blush without any control variables, saying that the globalized firms, if you will, are actually specializing in tasks that require less educated workers or in lower skilled occupations. And here we look at the task demand measures themselves, and these are, as I described them, constructed in the way I described. And you can again see that the FDI firms compared to the non-FDI firms have fewer abstract tasks, more routine tasks, more manual tasks, and similarly for the exporting firms. Okay, so finally, here are the regression results. And so we try to control for the limitation here, of course, is that it's really a cross-sectional regression. We have 2 years from Guangdong, but the linking is that great, so we're just pooling the data from the 2 waves here. And we do control for the first column for each outcome is with no fixed effects, and then we add the district fixed effects, which is a region within a city, and is how the sampling was done. And then we also add in industry fixed effects. And so the results are quite robust, that FDI and export share, our 2 main globalization measures, consistently show that they have less abstract tasks, more routine tasks, more manual tasks. And then we also, of course, control for other firm variables, whether they're state enterprises, the capital labor ratio, the size as measured by employment, and the labor productivity. And here you actually can see that the scale variable and the capital labor variable are not really strongly associated with the task demand. It's really the labor productivity, which is basically sales per worker. And there you do see, as expected, more productive firms are going to have higher abstract tasks and lower routine and manual tasks. Okay. We can also just look directly at the occupational structure and the educational, basically the demand for different skills of workers and different occupations. And here we do it for the 6 five, other than other, the five categories. And you can see that for the production workers, export share significantly increased. If you're an exporting firm doing more exports, you're going to have many more, you're going to hire more production workers. And production workers is by far the biggest category. It counts for about 2/3 of all of the workers in the firms. And then for salesmen, which is really related to, these are very skilled workers. There's fewer in the FDI and export share, and there's also fewer technical workers in the FDI. The other coefficients are also, I think, as, well, actually the manager and office worker ones are not kind of the right sign. It's being dominated, obviously, by the technical workers, but overall, there's some evidence that certainly the significant effects that the globalization is affecting the types of occupational structure in the firms. And finally, if you look at the demand for education for middle school worker shares and college and above worker shares, you see quite strongly again that FDI firms and high export firms are associated with more low-skilled workers, the middle and below, and fewer high-skilled workers, the college and above. Actually, I had a few. Oh, I think those didn't make the translation here. I had a couple of figures. Anyway, okay. So that's it. So the main contribution here, and we still have a lot of ways we want to extend the work to try to understand to what extent, for instance, the effect of globalization in terms of firm characteristics on task demand is mainly accounted for by education, occupation, or even within education or occupation categories, we still see effects of the globalization on the task demand. But I think overall the message is quite clear that we argue that this is the first convincing microeconomic evidence that globalization has reduced the demand for abstract tasks and increased the demand for routine and manual tasks. We've also done some provincial regression analysis, which is showing that exporting seems to also be associated with a decline in routine, a decline in abstract tasks over time, but no time to present that here. So it's consistent with China specializing in routine-intensive activities and with the outsourcing of routine tasks from developed countries to China. Now, the last point of this conclusion is that I believe, so this isn't really based on the results, but based on some of the trends in what's happening in the manufacturing sector in China, I think that eventually the trend is likely to eventually follow more the international pattern with increasing non-routine abstract skills and less routine stuff. There's some evidence that this is happening in the whole labor market in China since 2010. I showed you those earlier results. But also, as Chinese manufacturing firms capture larger shares of global value chains, become less export-oriented, more capital-intensive, and more productive, the demand for abstract tasks will increase and routine and manual tasks will decrease. And the other thing I think that's pertinent to say is that routine tasks are easy to move, but just because they've come from, let's say, the US or Europe and been outsourced to China, or from Hong Kong to China or Taiwan to China, it doesn't mean that in the future those very same jobs, especially textile manufacturing, aren't going to be moved by Chinese firms to Vietnam, Cambodia. So you could see a re-outsourcing in some way, which would actually have the opposite effect and would reduce the routine tasks in China and increase the abstract tasks. So I think this is very similar to the type of patterns that was described in the previous presentation, where they're part of global value chains, and it really depends which parts of these value chains you're specializing in. Because that can be very fluid, right, as the comparative advantage reveals itself over time. So thank you. I didn't have anyone timing me. I don't know how we're doing.
You're doing very well.
Okay, great. So does anyone have any questions on this? And sorry for the delay again. Yeah.
So if you did this analysis by sector, what would it look like by industry? If you... What do you think?
I think Well, if you think about the theory, it should be true for all industries. In fact, I mean, in an average sense it is, because we control for industry fixed effects. So within industries we see, on average, this is the pattern. Now, whether some industries have more or fewer FDI firms or more or fewer export firms, or they're specializing in a different part of the production chain in different industries, so they're less kind of routine specialized or more routine specialized. I think that's possible, but you know, we don't have enough firms per industry to do a very convincing analysis separate analysis by industry.
So the result for state-owned enterprise, I thought that was quite interesting. So it seemed that for the SOEs, you see that the non-routine, so the abstract ones are. So why is that? Why is that? More abstract. Yeah, more abstract tasks in the SOEs rather than the rest. At least from the regression tables, it seems like it.
It's just SOE employment policy, you know. They overhire and they are trying to share rents with the friends of the owners, and so it's padded, I think, at the managerial levels, especially. Of course, SOEs have access to more capital, easy loans, so they're going to be more capital intensive, which also could be more complementary. Of course, we control, in a broad sense, for capital labor ratios, but there may be other ways and senses in which it's easy for them to buy complementary inputs that would be advantageous to more skilled tasks too. That's just a hypothesis. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, thank you. It's been a very long day, and this is the last session, and appreciate your patience and attendance. And we can get ready for dinner. Great. Thank you very much.